Here you have my country promoting this, and we promote this policy vigilantly. We promote it through the League of Nations and then the United Nations. We promote it through multilateral institutions and international organizations and through bilateral relationships, right? We do it, we create we basically under Nixon 40 years ago, the DEA, our Federal Drug Enforcement Administration, becomes the first truly global police agency. I mean, in the past you had imperial police, the Roman Imperial Police, the Tsarist Imperial Police, the Gestapo. You had supranational law policing organizations, right? But we become the first sort of global agency. This is some of my research. And we have agents by the late 1970s stationed in 40 or 50 countries. They are training local law enforcement. When I would go in Europe and Latin America and interview the drug enforcement agents from whichever country, they would have the certificate on the wall having been to the DEA training program. Some of the European norms around policing, some of the resistance in Europe to the notion of agent provocateur, the use of informants, the use of undercover, right? You know, with DEA over years, here's how this works, here's why it works better, slowly beginning to change the norms in this way. So I remember when I was working for that year in the State Department in the mid-1980s, and they were planning the new International Drug Control Convention. And once again, the State Department legal experts helping with the drafting, getting other countries, some country in the Caribbean, somebody else to take the lead. But a continuous commitment to this issue. If the United States wanted the criminalization of coca from Bolivia and Peru, and if the one government would not agree, just consistent pressure, consistent pressure, consistent pressure. Until finally you have a government who says, okay, I agree, or says to the US government, what will you give me if I agree? And the US does some favor, right? And at the same time, not just the US, right? Because you also have, as I mentioned, the transnational moral entrepreneurs. You have the international medical societies. You have in Latin America, you know, the physicians, the others, looking down their oftentimes white noses at the indios, the campesinos with their big cheek full of coca. And the reason those people are so low and uneducated is because it must be, the causal relationship must be the drug is calling this rather than the other, right? And a persistent pressure, which continues to some very good extent until this day, You know, in the mid-1990s, the World Health Organization, WHO, does a 19-country study with leading academics from around the world to look at coca and cocaine. And they come to two conclusions. That coca, the chewing of the coca leaf, is by and large, not only is it not bad for your health, it actually may be a net benefit because of the vitamins and other things in the coca leaf. That the only downside is the lime that they put there to help the coca leaf break down so you chew it. And they also point out that the large majority of cocaine consumers around the world are not addicts, do not have a problem with cocaine. That report is never published because my government blocks it, right? So we have been eagerly representing this, you know, the opposition to needle exchange, right? I mean, you talk to people in the international system, and they say if you want to talk harm reduction, talk to the HIV/AIDS people in the international system, not the drug control people, right? I mean, until just a few years ago, my government would systematically oppose any mention of harm reduction or needle exchange in any global documentation, right? I mean, it's changed a little bit recently under Obama. So basically, to quote an American phrase, the United States has truly been the evil empire of the global war on drugs for the last century. Just recently, the Russians have seized the baton. Remarkable. You know, you now have the new head of the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, Fedotov, a Russian, very successful Russian foreign ministry bureaucrat. And you have, as the new Russian drug czar, Ivanov, who I think is just a thug. I mean, just, you know, and Russia, a policy which persists in its prohibition on methanol maintenance. right? For purely ideological reasons, a policy, the old American policy is if you're an addict, you're better dead, right? Death is the best alternative by and large, right? And with the notions of punitive and coerced treatment, I mean, in Russia, you know, a little bit like some parts of Asia, are taken to a remarkable extreme. So the Russians are now sort of, as America loses some of its deep-seated commitment and ferocity as we become slightly more moderate since the turn with Obama, just slightly, the Russians are seizing this. But still, we have the resources and the ability. Now, that's been the evolution. The question becomes, and by the way, I don't want to put it all in the US because obviously there are domestic traditions that come within certain countries, but I should say that the racial piece, from what I know of England and Australia and many other countries, that the part about the skin color or the foreignness of the drug user also plays a pivotal role in at least those other countries as well. There are many countries that agreed to criminalize cannabis back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and they don't even know what it is. It's like, oh, we have to sign this international convention. They want us to criminalize something called cannabis, but we don't have it here, so okay. Without ever imagining that, you know, 10 years later, they might have it here, and then they would have this problem of criminalization, and people would not even know where did this come from in the first place. The other thing, just to point out about this, that's also sort of quasi-religious-like. I mean, to make a gross, sweeping judgment about the evolution of religions, right? Which is, if you think about, you know, the original, you know, Jesus, Abraham, Muhammad, I mean, these begin with these incredibly, especially in their time, incredibly advanced moral notions, right? About introducing certain principles of behavior. You know, the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill, murder, adult, you know, upstanding principles, you know, even some of the notions associated with the monotheistic God and what that means, right? You know, and Jesus, the things that Jesus speaks to, you know, beautiful notions of mostly, not entirely, but mostly, right? And then, of course, what happens in any religion is that first you need, you know, you have the original impetus, humanitarian and good, and then that needs to be put down into rituals and rules. And then you develop institutions and rules in order to propagate these things and to enforce these things, right? And then, in fact, these institutions take on the power of the state so that they begin to take what were initially moral notions and make them into criminal laws for which one can be punished. And then what happens is those people charged with the enforcement of these laws and rituals abandon and even forget the original underlying impetus for these laws and rituals in the first place. It's why so many like to point out the contradiction between what Jesus said and what the church in many places actually does. The same is so true with the global war on drugs and drug prohibition. Because even there is the racist element, the political element, but there is also some element, some humanitarian element, some element of believing that we can protect the vulnerable through these laws. But at this point, and this is the great tension with law enforcement and police, because there is no tradition in law enforcement and policing to ask where and how and why are these laws what they are. And therefore, they enforce them blindly. And when they're frustrated by their inabilities to enforce them effectively, at least in my country and many others, law enforcement then becomes an advocate for new laws to help them enforce the laws that they could not enforce before. So for tougher penalties, or for criminalizing the corollary activities, or for criminalizing the conspiratorial activities, or if you can't win by seizing the drugs, let's criminalize the money that comes with the drugs. I mean, and they become this very, very powerful, you know, entity pushing for this. You have this problem of having forgotten whatever humanitarian and health-driven notion of protecting people from the risks and dangers of drugs is essentially forgotten or deliberately ignored by those people in charge. And I will also say that in the field of criminology, at least when I was involved in it in the 80s and early 90s, and at least in the American, not so much as I think in Europe, what was remarkable is criminology. I think it is the only one of the academic disciplines whose very existence and whose definitions and boundaries is established by the state. By the state. If we decriminalize some huge area of activity, it is no longer a subject of criminology. If the state chooses to criminalize something, it is now a subject of criminology. What other academic discipline has its boundaries and subject matter determined by the state, right? Now, of course, when the state is also, as in my country, the principal funding agency, you double up in that regard, right? So what was missing in at least the American criminology, was the amount of literature looking at how, in fact, things become criminalized and why they become criminalized. Astounding, the absence of actually thinking deeply about that. I mean, a little bit. But most people just carrying on the notions of understanding enforcement rather than, or maybe why people commit crime, rather than the basic question of why and how did this become a crime in the first place, and how are the ways that we might reduce this harmful activity other than the criminal system. I mean, now, one of the other problems with my country having been the dominant advocate for this global prohibition system is that we have a particular model of it. And it's not so much a model that's been true of our history. It's really a model that has emerged in the last 30 years, which is that we fell in love with mass incarceration in the last 30 years. Our rates of incarceration 40 years ago were not so dramatically different in Europe or other countries. A little higher. We have more violent crime, more gun crime because of our gun culture in many parts of the country. But beginning in 1980, we engaged in this passionate relationship as a society with incarceration. This belief that people deserve to go to prison for violence, and that the tougher the better. Right? And then in the late 1980s, when crack cocaine comes and we have these, we actually, unfortunately, I actually think if America had been engaged in a real war at that time, we may not have had the drug war. But we didn't have a real war at that time. It was, you know, the end of communism. We didn't have, Vietnam was over. Nobody wanted to have another war with communists or guerrillas anywhere, right? But we, you know, as Americans, we need our wars. And the drugs was so ripe. It had an international and a domestic piece. It was like communism in the early 50s, right? You know, and McCarthyism. We go through what happens in America in the late 1980s, late 1990s is like McCarthyism. Right? McCarthyism in the early 1950s, right? The ferocious paranoia of that period, Senator Joe McCarthy and the crazy fear of it, right? You know, yes, there was a threat, an aggressive Stalinist Soviet imperial thing, but they were not lapping at our borders and they were not taking over the world, but we needed to be ready. Yes, there were communists and spies in America, but there was not a communist under every bed or a spy around every corner, right? But nonetheless, for a few years, the American people were persuaded, and McCarthy thrived. That's what happened with drugs in the United States in the late 1980s. There was a McCarthy. It was, yes, drugs were coming from abroad, but it's not as if people were dropping, you know, from planes, drugs into schoolyards all around America. Yes, there was domestic drug problems and all this, but it was not as if the vast majority of Americans were using drugs. And what happened was a level of criminalization where penalties were doubled, tripled, quadrupled, quintupled, with the notion that one should do a cost assessment before passing a law, that one should ask the academics to assess what would be the likely consequences of this law, what would be the impact on the criminal justice system, what would be the impact on the health system, what would be the impact on drug markets. That was almost, to even suggest that, was a form of defeatism, was a form of almost treason. Why would you ask that, right? This is a moral crusade. And just as a crusade, you know, when the Christian soldiers marched off to Jerusalem, it was not important to ask how many of them were going to come back, right? Or what it was going to cost. It was a moral imperative. And in this sense, the drug war of the 1980s became this moral. Nixon, in historical comparison, was a paragon of moderation. Because he also built one of the biggest, he also put huge resources into drug treatment, and there was an element of pragmatism still then, right? But by the late 1980s, you know, the Reagan Revolution culminating in this drug war, and a period, there was, in 1990, when Americans were asked, what is the most serious problem confronting America? 50% roughly said the drug problem is the #1 problem confronting America. A year later, it was maybe 6%. Nothing had changed. But this was a period of mass hysteria. And we still live with those laws today. Right? In that period, and I think most of you as criminologists will know this, we engaged in this orgy of criminalization and incarceration. And just a few small statistics. In 1980, we had 500,000 people behind bars, federal and state prisons and local jails. We now have roughly 2.4 million people behind bars, right? In 1980, there were about 50,000 people locked up for violating a drug law. Tonight, there are 500,000 people locked up for violating a drug law. Everything from distribution, sale, possession, in addition to unknown hundreds of thousands for drug-related violations of parole and probation, where it's not counted as a drug charge because the initial cause of the parole or probation was not a drug charge. Right? In addition, we have hundreds of thousands of more behind bars for prostitution and predatory crimes related to a drug addiction. Right? The United States, we have less than 5% of the world's population. We have almost 25% of the world's incarcerated population. Less than 5%, 300 million people out of almost 7 billion, 2.4 million people behind bars out of roughly 10 million. Right? We rank first in the world in the per capita incarceration of our fellow citizens. #1, right? The Russians and the Belarusians are second and third, huffing and puffing. We have left them in the dust. America is #1. #1. Our rates of incarceration are 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times the rates of incarceration in most European countries, even as it goes up. I don't know if it's still true, but at least until recently, there were more people locked up in the United States for violating a drug law than there were locked up for everything in the Western Europe, the original EU countries, which had 100 million more people. So here you have the original EU countries with 100 million more people in the US, and their total number of incarceration is less than the United States locks up just for a drug law violation. Just to give you a sense, one of the points I'm going to make at the Human Rights Conference on Wednesday is that if we were more normal, like more typical in our incarceration rates, and some other country locked up people like we did, we would regard that as a massive violation of human rights. Because, I mean, apart from torturing and killing people, what's the next thing that you can do? And in fact, it may be worse than torture in some respects, is to take away people's freedom, give them a number, see them on their, everything that incarceration means, especially in my country, as opposed to your kind of Scandinavian version of incarceration. I mean, by Americans, well, that's incarceration? Where's the punishment? I mean, it's just a different idea. We have private prison corporations now. You don't have enough prisons in Hawaii, ship them to Montana. I mean, the whole notion of keeping people close to family and re-entry it's kind of an afterthought. We just don't do that very well. Not just the private prison corporations, the prison guards union. In California, the union of prison guards is the most powerful union in the state capital. And they have spent millions of dollars to defeat our efforts to reform these things, right? Fortunately, they're not so opposed to marijuana legalization. Probably because they know if you build a prison in the middle of nowhere, what do the prison guards want to do when they get home? So much easier to deal with that. So our model of very aggressive policing together with high levels of incarceration, and then of course, as you all know, the racial piece to this thing, right? Of the people behind bars, something like almost half of them are black. Blacks represent 13% of our population, but almost 50% of the incarcerated population. right? The rates of incarceration of, say, black women on drug charges, if the rate of incarceration of white, I don't have the exact figures, but if the rate of incarceration of white men went up by 400%, the rate of incarceration of white women and also white women went up. I mean, in our federal prisons, something like 65 or 70% of all the women in federal prison are there for a drug law violation, right? Because women don't tend to go as much for violent crime and other things like that, right? But then the rates increase for black women, and I mean 2,000%. I mean, crazy, crazy numbers. In many cities, a majority of black men will have some criminal record by the time they're age 25. And because, remember also, we don't just rely on prison. We are faster to arrest people. If you're arrested, you are more likely to go to prison than most other countries. If you go to prison, we keep you there longer than most other countries do. Once you come out, we are more likely to keep you under the parole or probation system for long periods of time. And until the day you die, we are more likely to treat you as a second-class or third-class citizen, where you may be deprived of the right to vote, right? You may be deprived, depends upon the state you live in, you may be deprived of the right to get a license. You can learn how to become a barber in prison, and then you cannot get a barber's license when you get out of prison because you've been in prison. I mean, crazy stuff. I mean, teachers, all this sorts of thing. So we have this highly comprehensive punitive system. There's now like 13 or 14 million Americans who have a felony, not a misdemeanor, a felony conviction, right? If you look at some of the implications, when it comes to the right to vote, if the laws in the United States regarding criminalization and the right to vote were the same in the United States as they are in most countries around the rest of the world, where many times you're allowed to vote even if you're behind bars, and you're certainly allowed to vote if you're outside prison, if that had been the case, it would have affected between 5 and 10 Senate races for the U.S. Senate. It would have affected the balance of power in the Senate, and it probably would have affected who won the presidency in 2002 and in 2004. Just to give you a sense of the magnitude, we have disenfranchised, we have taken away the right to vote, roughly 5 million Americans, right? Overwhelmingly people of color, most of whom tend to vote Democratic. Now, was this a strategic thing? In some respects it was, especially in the South. There's now a very popular book called The New Jim Crow. You all know the reference to Jim Crow refers to the racist laws that succeeded slavery. Jim Crow were the racist laws in the American South from the late 1870s until the 1960s. And the book by Michelle Alexander is called The New Jim Crow, making the case of how the war on drugs has become the new form of racial oppression. Right? Okay, enough about how terrible my country is.